The wilderness is not a park, and it is certainly not your friend. We spend our lives building walls and paving roads to trick ourselves into thinking we have tamed the earth, but that is a lie we tell to sleep at night. When you step past the tree line and into the places where the sunlight struggles to hit the forest floor, you are entering a kingdom that does not recognize your laws. I have spent the better part of 2 decades staring at maps and reading coroner reports that make no sense, and the one thing I have learned is that the woods have a memory. They remember when we were prey, and sometimes they decide to remind us that nothing has actually changed. We are going to talk about a man named Michael Cook, who learned this lesson in a way that most people do not survive to tell. Michael was not a city boy looking for a weekend thrill or a hiker who forgot to bring a canteen. He was a man who grew up with the dirt of the mountains under his fingernails and a deep understanding of the risks involved in the high country. He knew the sounds of the night and the way the wind shifts before a storm, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the day the world decided to stop making sense. It was a day like any other in the late autumn, when the air carries a bite and the leaves have turned into a brittle carpet of rust and gold. He was out in the deep timber, moving through the brush with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked these trails 1,000 times before. The sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long and distorted shadows that stretched across the uneven ground like skeletal fingers. He was roughly 4 miles from the nearest paved road when the first layer of reality began to peel away. It started with the silence, which is a phenomenon I have heard described by hundreds of witnesses who have had brushes with the unknown. In the woods, there is always a baseline of noise, from the constant chatter of squirrels to the distant drumming of a woodpecker or the rustle of wind through the canopy. But Michael described a moment where the entire world went absolutely mute, as if someone had placed a heavy glass jar over the entire forest. The birds stopped mid-song, and the wind simply ceased to exist, leaving the air feeling heavy and pressurized against his eardrums. It is a sensory deprivation that triggers a primal alarm in the human brain, because it signifies that the natural order has been interrupted by something the environment fears. He stood frozen in the center of a small clearing, holding his breath and listening to the sound of his own heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The air began to smell of something metallic and sharp, like the scent of an old penny or the ozone that lingers after a lightning strike. Michael scanned the perimeter of the clearing, his eyes darting between the thick trunks of the ancient hemlocks that stood like silent sentinels. That was when he saw it standing about 60 feet away near the edge of a dense thicket of mountain laurel. At first, his brain tried to categorize it as a deer or a stray calf, because the human mind is desperate to find logic in the illogical. But as he focused his vision, he realized the proportions were all wrong, and the creature was standing in a way that defied the laws of skeletal anatomy. It was tall and spindly, with limbs that seemed to have too many joints and skin the color of a wet sidewalk. It did not move with the fluidity of an animal, but with a jerky and stuttering motion that looked like a corrupted video file playing in real time. The creature had no visible eyes or mouth, just a smooth and featureless expanse of gray flesh where a face should have been. It stood there in the absolute silence, vibrating with a high-frequency energy that made Michael's vision blur and his teeth ache. He tried to raise his camera or reach for the sidearm he carried for protection, but his muscles felt like they had been turned into leaden weights. There was a sense of profound malice radiating from the thing, a cold and calculated hunger that felt older than the mountains themselves. It began to move toward him, not by walking but by flickering across the distance in short and impossible bursts of speed. 1 second it was 50 feet away, and the next it was 30 feet away, with no transition in between, as if the space between them was being folded and discarded. Michael managed to break the paralysis through sheer animal panic, and he turned to bolt back the way he had come. He was running through terrain he knew by heart, but the trail seemed to have shifted and warped beneath his boots. The trees looked taller and more menacing, and the ground felt spongy and unstable, like he was running across the back of a giant breathing lung. He could hear the thing behind him making a sound like dry sticks snapping or the clicking of a massive insect. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he saw the gray shape getting closer, its limbs flailing in a chaotic and non-Euclidean fashion. He felt a wave of intense nausea wash over him, and the light of the setting sun turned a sickly shade of violet that made the forest look like a landscape from a fever dream. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, and his legs were screaming for him to stop. He finally burst through a line of pines and found himself standing on the edge of a steep embankment that led down to a rocky creek bed. Without thinking, he threw himself down the slope, tumbling over jagged rocks and through thorny brambles that tore at his clothing and skin. He landed in the shallow water with a splash that sounded like an explosion in the oppressive silence of the woods. He scrambled under a massive overhang of granite and pressed himself into the cold and damp earth, praying that the thing would pass him by. He stayed there for what felt like hours, watching the grey light of dusk fade into the pitch black of a moonless night, while the clicking sound circled the rocks above his head. When the sun finally began to bleed over the eastern horizon, the silence finally broke with the distant call of a crow. The heavy pressure in the air lifted and the forest returned to its normal state of rustling leaves and shifting shadows. Michael crawled out from his hiding spot, battered and bruised, with his clothes hanging in rags and his mind fractured by what he had witnessed. He made his way back to his vehicle in a state of shock, not even remembering the walk or how he found his keys. When he finally looked at his watch, he realized that while it felt like he had been running for 20 minutes, over 14 hours had actually passed. He had entered the woods on a Tuesday afternoon, and he was returning on a Wednesday morning with a gap in his memory that he would never be able to fill. He returned to civilization, but he was never the same man who had walked into those woods with a smile on his face. He suffered from night terrors and a lingering sense of being watched, even in the middle of a crowded city street. He spoke to investigators and researchers, but most of them looked at him with a mixture of pity and skepticism, thinking he had simply suffered a mental break or a drug-induced hallucination. But those of us who look into the dark corners of the world know better, because Michael S.'s story is not unique. There are physical markers left behind in these encounters that cannot be explained away by psychology. He had strange circular burns on his shoulders that looked like they had been cauterized by a laser, and his compass never pointed north again after that day. The story of Michael Cook is a reminder that there are pockets of this world where the veil is thin and things from the outside can slip through. We like to think of the wilderness as a resource or a playground, but it is actually a vast and indifferent laboratory where the experiments are not being conducted by us. Michael survived his encounter, but he left a piece of his soul back in that clearing near the mountain Laurel. He is a ghost walking among the living, forever haunted by the knowledge that the world is much bigger and much hungrier than we are led to believe. The woods are still there, waiting for the next person to step off the trail and into the silence that precedes the end of everything they know. The unresolved nature of Michael S.'s experience is what keeps me awake at night, because it suggests a pattern of predation that we have no defense against. If something can manipulate time and space to hunt a man in his own backyard, then nowhere is truly safe. We look for footprints and hair samples, but we are looking for biological entities in a situation that might be purely metaphysical or interdimensional. Michael Cook is lucky to be alive, but he is a prisoner of a memory that no one wants to believe. The grey thing in the woods is still out there, and it does not need a name or a face to be the most terrifying thing you will ever encounter. This case bears a striking and disturbing resemblance to the disappearance of Danny Filippidis, a firefighter who vanished from a ski resort in New York and reappeared 6 days later in California with no memory of how he got there. Like Michael, Danny was an experienced outdoorsman who suddenly found himself in a reality that had shifted beneath his feet. There is also the case of Jaryd Atadero, who disappeared in the Colorado mountains only for his clothing to be found years later in an area that had been searched dozens of times. These cases suggest a recurring theme of spatial anomalies and a force that can move humans across vast distances in the blink of an eye. We are not the masters of the earth, we are merely the guests who have overstayed our welcome in a house that belongs to something else. The rain has been hitting the window of this office for 3 hours now, and it sounds like bird bones snapping against the glass. I have the file for Michael Cook spread out across the desk, and the deeper I go, the more I feel that familiar cold coil of dread tightening in my gut. Most people who hear this story want to look at Michael with a squint of pity, as if he is just another broken man who let the isolation of the timberline crack his mind. They want to believe it was a chemical imbalance, or a bad reaction to some tainted berries, because the alternative is a jagged pill that no one can swallow. But I have seen the photographs of the marks on his skin, and I have held the compass that refuses to acknowledge the magnetic poles of this earth. The burns on Michael's shoulders are not the chaotic blisters of a campfire accident or the jagged streaks of a lightning strike. They are perfect circles 3 inches in diameter, and the skin inside those rings is smooth as polished marble and completely devoid of hair follicles or sweat glands. When you look at them under a magnifying glass, you do not see the messy architecture of human scarring. Instead, you see a pattern of cauterization that suggests the flesh was rearranged at a molecular level by a heat so precise it did not even singe the hair an inch away. It is the kind of mark a biologist might leave on a specimen they intend to track for the rest of its natural life. Michael told me that the air in that mountain laurel clearing smelled like scorched copper and old ozone. He described a silence that was so heavy it felt like being submerged in a vat of oil, where the sounds of the forest were blocked out by a high-frequency hum that vibrated in his teeth. He is a man who spent 20 years navigating the backcountry, and he knows the difference between the quiet of a predator and the silence of a vacuum. He said the grey thing did not walk toward him so much as it drifted through the physical space, as if the trees and the rocks were merely suggestions rather than obstacles. It had no face that he could comprehend, just a shifting mass of static that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on its edges. The compass he carried is sitting in a lead-lined box in my bottom drawer, because if I leave it out, it starts to affect the electronics in the room. The needle does not just spin or lag. It points toward Michael whenever he is in the room, and when he leaves it points toward the mountain laurel clearing 80 miles to the north. It is as if the internal physics of the device were rewritten by that encounter, and it no longer recognizes the magnetic field of the planet. We are taught that the laws of nature are immutable, and that the universe follows a strict set of rules, but Michael is living proof that those rules can be suspended by something with the right set of tools. He told me that when he finally managed to stumble back to his truck, his watch had stopped at exactly the moment he entered the clearing. When he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he did not recognize the eyes staring back at him. They were bloodshot, and the pupils were fixed at different sizes, as if his brain had been hit by a massive neurological surge. He felt a profound sense of grief, not for his lost time, but for a version of himself that he knew was gone forever. He is a ghost walking among the living, and he spends his nights staring at the tree line, wondering if the grey thing is looking back through the eyes of the owls or the shadows of the pines. The wilderness is not the pristine cathedral we see in the glossy magazines and the tourism brochures. It is a vast and indifferent laboratory where the experiments are being conducted by entities that do not share our morality or our understanding of pain. We go into the woods to find ourselves, but Michael Cook found something that had been looking for him for a very long time. He was not a hiker who got lost. He was a subject that was collected and then discarded when the data had been harvested. The mountain laurel still grows in that clearing, and it probably looks beautiful to the next person who decides to step off the trail, but the soil there is tainted with a coldness that never goes away. I spent yesterday talking to a physicist who looked at the data from Michael's compass, and he turned pale before he handed the papers back to me. He said that for a needle to behave like that, it would have to be exposed to a localized gravitational anomaly that should have crushed a human body into a pulp. Yet Michael walked out of that clearing with nothing but a few circular burns and a shattered psyche. This suggests that whatever took him has the ability to manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe to create a pocket of altered reality. It is a predation that we have no defense against because we do not even have the vocabulary to describe the hunter. Michael says that sometimes he hears the hum again late at night when the house is quiet and the wind is low. It is not a sound that comes through his ears, but a vibration that starts in his marrow and works its way up to the base of his skull. He feels a pull toward the north, a magnetic tug on his very soul that tells him he still belongs to that grey thing in the woods. He is a prisoner on a long leash, and he knows that one day the leash will be retracted and he will return to the silence of the clearing. He is lucky to be alive by our standards, but he is a man who has seen behind the curtain of reality, and he knows that the world is much bigger and much hungrier than we are led to believe. The case of Michael Cook is a terrifying echo of other disappearances that defy any rational explanation. Take the story of Danny Filippidis, who was a seasoned firefighter and an experienced outdoorsman. In February of 2018, Danny was on a ski trip at Whiteface Mountain in New York. He went to get his phone from his car and simply vanished into the winter air. 6 days later, he turned up in Sacramento, California, still wearing his ski gear and his helmet, with no memory of how he had crossed nearly 3,000 miles of terrain. He was confused and disoriented with a gap in his life that can never be filled by the laws of geography or transport. Then there is the haunting mystery of young Jaryd Atadero, who vanished in the rugged terrain of the Colorado mountains in October of 1999. He was only 3 years old when he moved ahead of a group of hikers and disappeared in the blink of an eye. Despite thousands of man-hours spent searching the area with dogs and helicopters, not a single trace was found at the time. Years later, his clothing was discovered on a steep rocky ledge in an area that had been thoroughly combed by search teams. The clothing was turned inside out, but the shoes were still tied and there was no evidence of an animal attack or a fall. It was as if he had been plucked from the earth and then placed back down years later as a mocking reminder of our insignificance. These stories are the ripples on the surface of a dark and deep pond that we are only beginning to measure. We look for footprints and biological markers because that is what we know how to do, but we are dealing with a force that might be purely metaphysical or interdimensional. We are the guests in a house that belongs to something else, and we have stayed far too long without paying the rent. The woods are waiting, and the silence is growing louder with every person who steps into the shadows and never comes back. We are not the masters of this earth, and the sooner we realize that the better our chances of surviving the night. The unresolved nature of Michael's experience is what keeps me awake at night, because it suggests a pattern of predation that is surgical and absolute. There are no screams and there are no struggles, just a sudden shift in the frequency of the world, and then a void where a human being used to be. Michael is a survivor, but he is also a warning written in scorched skin and broken magnets. He is the one who came back to tell us that the grey thing is still out there, and it does not need a name or a face to be the most terrifying thing you will ever encounter. Stay on the trail and keep the light burning, because the darkness has eyes, and it has been watching us since the beginning of time. The more I look into these files, the more I see the connections that the authorities refuse to acknowledge. They want to treat every disappearance as an isolated incident of human error or bad luck, because to admit a pattern would be to admit a lack of control. They talk about dehydration and hypothermia while ignore the fact that clothing is found in impossible places and people reappear thousands of miles away. The system is designed to protect the status quo, not to protect us from the things that live in the gaps between the trees. I see the same details repeating across decades and across continents like a signature left by an artist who knows he will never be caught. The mountain laurel clearing where Michael Cook lost his soul is still there, and the locals avoid it without really knowing why. They say the birds do not sing there, and the deer will go miles out of their way to bypass that specific patch of woods. It is a dead zone in the middle of a living forest, a place where the air feels thin and the light seems to bend in ways that hurt the eyes. I have stood at the edge of that clearing, and I felt the same cold hum that Michael described. It is a feeling of being viewed under a microscope by a technician who has no empathy for the slide. Michael told me that during the missing hours he felt as though he were being stretched across a vast distance, like a piece of wire being pulled thin. He saw flashes of landscapes that did not belong to this earth, and he heard voices that sounded like grinding metal and rushing water. He believes he was being shown the architecture of the trap. We all live in a world where the walls are made of perception, and the hunters are the ones who built the cage. He cannot sleep in the dark anymore because he knows the dark is not empty. It is a liquid medium that things can swim through to reach us whenever they are hungry. I often think about Danny Filippidis and the sheer impossibility of his journey across the continent. How does a man in ski boots walk across 3,000 miles without being seen or recorded by a single camera? The answer is not in the physical world, but in the folding of space that Michael Cook experienced. If you can bend the paper, then the two opposite corners can touch in an instant. We are living on the surface of the paper and we have no idea that something is folding it for its own purposes. Danny was a victim of a spatial anomaly that we cannot even begin to calculate. The clothes of Jaryd Atadero sitting on that ledge are the most chilling piece of evidence I have ever encountered. They were not weathered or torn in a way that suggested years of exposure to the elements. They were placed there as a statement, a piece of evidence left behind by a force that wants us to know it can take whatever it wants and return it whenever it pleases. It is a psychological warfare, waged against a species that thinks it is at the top of the food chain. We are merely the livestock in a paddock that has no fences but the ones in our own minds. Michael Cook sits in his small apartment now with the curtains drawn and a shotgun leaning against the wall. He knows the gun will do nothing against the grey thing, but it gives him a sense of agency that he lost in the clearing. He is waiting for the hum to return, and he knows that next time he might not be discarded. He might be kept for the duration of the experiment. I look at the burns on his shoulders and I see the marks of a world that is much older and much more dangerous than we can imagine. The wilderness is calling, and it is not a friendly voice. I will keep digging through these reports, and I will keep looking for the truth, even if it leads me into the same silence that took Michael Cook. There is a weight to this work that most people cannot understand, a burden of knowledge that makes the rest of the world seem trivial and small. We are fighting a war against an enemy we cannot see, and we are losing people every single day to the shadows. Michael is just one man among thousands, but his story is the key that unlocks the door to a reality we are not prepared to face. The rain has stopped now, but the silence outside is even worse. It is the kind of quiet that precedes a storm or a disappearance. I can almost hear the hum starting at the base of my own skull as I look at the map of the mountain laurel clearing. We are all just one step away from the edge of the world, and most of us will never even see the hand that pushes us. Michael Cook survived to tell the tale, but he is the exception that proves the rule. The grey thing is still out there, and it is waiting for the next person to wander off the path and into the dark. If you are listening to this, then you are already part of the investigation. You are someone who has looked at the woods and felt that strange prickle on the back of your neck. You are someone who knows that the official stories do not add up, and that there is something moving in the periphery of our vision. Stay alert and stay together, because the moment you are alone is the moment you become a candidate for the laboratory. The patterns are there if you are brave enough to look at them, and the truth is far more terrifying than any ghost story. We are the guests who have overstayed our welcome in a house that belongs to something else. We walk through the halls and we sleep in the beds, but we do not own the keys. Michael Cook found the owner, and he barely made it out alive. Danny Filippidis was moved like a chess piece across a board he could not see. Jaryd Atadero was taken, and his remnants were left as a warning to those who think they are safe in the high places. The earth is not ours, and the sooner we accept our place in the hierarchy, the better our chances of surviving the encounter. The case of Michael Cook remains open in my mind because it suggests that the danger is not just in the remote wilderness but in the very fabric of the reality we inhabit. It is a reminder that there are pockets where the veil is thin, and things from the outside can slip through at will. We are vulnerable, and we are being watched by an intelligence that sees us as nothing more than biological data. The grey thing does not care about your name or your life, it only cares about the results of the test. And the test is never over. I am going to close this file for tonight and try to get some sleep, but I know the hum will be waiting for me in my dreams. I will see the circular burns and the broken compass, and I will wonder how many others are out there right now walking into a clearing they will never leave. The world is a hungry place, and we are the main course. Watch the tree line and listen to the silence, because the next story could be yours. Michael Cook is still out there waiting for the end, and so am I. There is a disturbing and undeniable link between these cases that points to a recurring theme of spatial anomalies and a force that can move humans across vast distances in the blink of an eye. The disappearance of Danny Filippidis, a firefighter who vanished from a ski resort in New York and reappeared 6 days later in California with no memory of his journey, is a testament to this terrifying power. Similarly, the case of Jaryd Atadero, whose clothing was found years later in a previously searched area of the Colorado mountains, suggests a manipulation of physical space that defies our current understanding of physics. These are not accidents. They are the calling cards of a predator that operates outside our three-dimensional world, and we are the prey caught in its invisible web.